Imagine the year 1914. Most cars still look like carriages, only without horses. Bodies are tall, angular, heavy, and designed more by tradition than by science. Drivers sit almost outside. The mechanics are raw, and aerodynamics in the world of motoring practically does not exist as a serious subject. And then something appears that looks not like a car, but like a vehicle from the future, an aircraft cabin, an airship on wheels, or a miniature submarine. The Alfa 4060 HP Aerodynamica, also known as the Siluro Riccati, was one of the most extraordinary experiments in automotive history. It was created long before the era of wind tunnels, concept cars, minivans, and futuristic prototypes. Its streamlined, one-box body with a round front, tapering rear, and small round side windows looked absurd against the backdrop of a world that was only just learning the automobile. And yet it was not merely a stylistic whim. This vehicle really worked. It really drove very fast, and it really showed that air could be just as important an opponent for a car as weight, power, or mechanical resistance. That is why the Alfa 4060 HP Aerodynamica is not just a museum oddity. It is one of the first great manifestos of aerodynamics in the history of the automobile. The history of this car begins with the Alfa brand, meaning Anonima Lombarda Fabbrica Automobili, the company that would only later become known as Alfa Romeo. At the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, the Milanese manufacturer was looking for a way to build a car more powerful, faster, and more prestigious than its earlier models. The task was entrusted to Giuseppe Morosi, one of the most important engineers in the early history of Alfa. In 1913, the 4060 HP model was created, a car intended for customers who wanted something more than an ordinary road vehicle. It was a very advanced construction for its time. A large chassis with a ladder frame, rear-wheel drive, a 4-speed gearbox, and a huge inline 4-cylinder engine with a capacity of more than 6 liters. The standard road version developed around 70 horsepower and could reach around 125 kilometers per hour. In an era when many cars struggled to exceed half that speed, this was an impressive result. There was also a Corsa version intended for sport, faster and lighter. The 4060 HP was therefore not only a luxury car, but also a machine with sporting ambitions. The most unusual chapter in the history of this model began when one of the examples fell into the hands of Count Mario, and according to some sources, Marco Riccati. He was a wealthy, eccentric man, and clearly fascinated by modernity. He lived in times when aviation was only beginning to ignite the imagination. Airships were considered a symbol of progress, and streamlined shapes were associated more with air and water than with roads. Riccati did not simply want another fast car. He wanted a vehicle that would combine the performance of a sporting Alfa with the practicality of a family car and protection from the weather. It was to be a closed 5-seater car, capable of fast driving and at the same time more comfortable on journeys than an open torpedo. With this idea, he turned to the Milanese company Carrozzeria Castagna, one of the most renowned Italian coach builders. Castagna had already been operating since the 19th century and had vast experience in building carriages and luxury bodies. This time, however, it received a commission completely different from all the others. It was to create a car that would be ahead of its era, not by a few years, but by entire decades. The body that was created at Castagna was an absolute shock. Instead of a classic hood, a separate cabin and protruding fenders, a one-box form resembling a drop of water was created. The front was rounded, the rear sharply tapered, and the whole was meant to cut through the air as gently as possible. The body was made of aluminum, which was intended to reduce weight and help preserve the performance of the base model. The characteristic front opening directed air to the vertically mounted radiator, hidden beneath the streamlined shell of the body. The windshield consisted of 3 sections and wrapped around the cabin like the glazing of an early aircraft. Round windows were placed on the sides, looking like portholes in a ship or submarine. The whole thing was strange, but very coherent in its own logic. The body was meant to cover almost everything: the engine, the frame, the wheels, the passenger compartment, and the luggage. Today we could say that the Aerodynamica was the great-grandfather of the minivan, the streamliner, and the concept car all at once. In 1914, however, there was not yet a language with which such a vehicle could be described. That is why many looked at it as a curiosity, not understanding that they were seeing the future. The construction of the Aerodynamica, however, was full of compromises resulting from the technological limitations of the era. The 4060 HP chassis had not been designed from the ground up for a streamlined body. It had a high frame, classic suspension, and large mechanical components that simply had to be covered with an aluminum shell. This made the car very tall for a vehicle with sporting ambitions. It was around 5.5 meters long, around 1 meter and 70 centimeters wide, and more than 2 meters high. Depending on the sources, the weight is given as from around 1,000 to around 1,500 kilograms, which shows how difficult it is today to clearly reconstruct all the parameters of the original. The unusual body also forced a peculiar driving position. Because the engine and radiator were inside the streamlined form, the driver sat far behind the windshield, almost halfway along the length of the car. Visibility through the front glazing was therefore theoretically good, but in practice limited by distance and the side elements of the body. The interior could accommodate 5 people, but it was not a comfortable car in the modern sense of the word. In summer, the closed aluminum cabin could become very hot. Futurism had its price. The most important thing, however, was that this unusual shape really improved performance. Underneath worked the powerful 4060 HP engine, an inline 4-cylinder unit with a capacity of 6,082 cubic centimeters, with 2 cylinder blocks, valves in the head, and a valve train based on shafts placed in the crankcase. The engine developed around 70 horsepower at 2,200 revolutions per minute. Today such power does not impress, but in 1914 it was very serious. Drive went to the rear wheels through a 4-speed manual gearbox. The standard Alfa 4060 HP reached around 125 kilometers per hour, and the sporting Corsa around 137 kilometers per hour. Meanwhile, the Aerodynamica, thanks to its streamlined body, could accelerate to around 139 kilometers per hour, and according to some accounts, even to values close to 150 kilometers per hour. This meant that a closed, 5-seater car with the appearance of an experimental capsule was able to equal or surpass the sports cars of its era. This is where the greatest significance of this project lies. Aerodynamics was not decoration. It was a real tool for increasing speed. It is worth remembering how radical this thinking was at that time. In 1914, most designers focused on engine power, frame strength, the quality of the suspension, and the brakes. Air was treated rather as something obvious, invisible, of little importance at the speeds many cars reached. Only the development of aviation and later racing experiments would make aerodynamic shapes begin to be treated more seriously. The Alfa 4060 HP Aerodynamica therefore appeared too early to become the beginning of a mass trend, but early enough that today it can be considered one of the first cars consciously subordinated to the fight against air resistance. Its form resembled an airship, a drop of water, a projectile, or a torpedo. Hence the name Siluro Ricotti, which roughly means Ricotti's torpedo. There was something extremely symbolic in this. A car that still used mechanics close to horse-drawn vehicles received a body inspired by the most modern dreams of the era. It stood with one foot in the 19th century and the other in a future that would truly arrive only many years later. In terms of usability, however, the Aerodynamica was far from ideal. Count Ricotti quickly became convinced that visionary form does not always mean everyday comfort. The closed aluminum body was striking and fast, but not very practical. The high cabin, unusual driving position, Limited ventilation and difficulty accessing some mechanical elements meant that the car fascinated more than it served. In 1915, barely a year after its creation, the owner decided on a radical change. The unique streamlined body was removed, and the car was rebuilt as a more classic open tourer. In this way, Castagna's futuristic experiment was brought back down to the realities of the era. The original body largely ceased to exist, and the later fate of the car is not entirely clear. This is one of the most bitter elements of this story. One of the most innovative vehicles of its time disappeared before the world had time to truly understand its significance. If it had survived in its original form, it would today be one of the most valuable automotive monuments in the world. Fortunately, the memory of this car did not disappear. In the 70s of the 20th century, when historians and collectors began to appreciate more strongly the pioneering experiments from before the First World War, a faithful replica of the Alfa 4060 HP Aerodynamica was created. It was built on the basis of surviving photographs, documentation, and knowledge of the original chassis. Today it can be seen in the Alfa Romeo Museum in Arese. It is precisely this reconstruction that allows the modern viewer to see how absurdly modern Riccati and Castagna's project was. Looking at it, it is hard to believe that we are talking about a car from 1914. Its silhouette does not fit the era of motoring before the First World War. It resembles more an experiment from the 30s, a streamliner prototype, or a strange concept from a post-war motor show. The replica, of course, does not have the same historical value as the lost original, but it has enormous educational significance. It allows us to understand that the history of motoring did not develop in a linear way. Sometimes individual visionaries ran so far ahead that their ideas remained lonely islands for decades. When it comes to the number of examples produced, the matter is exceptionally simple, and at the same time extremely important. The Alfa 4060 HP Aerodynamica was made in only one example. It was an individual project commissioned by Count Riccati and made by Carrozzeria Castagna on the chassis of the Alfa 4060 HP. The base 4060 HP model itself was also very rare. It was produced from 1913, with interruptions resulting from the First World War until the beginning of the 20s, and total production amounted to only around 27 examples. This means that even an ordinary Alfa 4060 HP is today an extremely rare vehicle, and the Aerodynamica version was an absolute one-off. It was not a series, it was not a catalog version, it was not a model intended for sale. It was an experiment, a demonstration of possibilities and the personal vision of one customer. In this sense, it can be considered one of the ancestors of the concept car. It was not created to fill the market, but to test an idea. And although that idea was not developed in production at the time, its significance from the perspective of history is enormous. Valuing such a car is very difficult, because the original does not exist in complete form, and the museum replica is not part of the normal market. If the original Alfa 4060 HP Aerodynamica had survived to our times in a condition close to the original, its value would probably be calculated not like that of an ordinary classic, but like that of a unique work of art and one of the most important prototypes in automotive history. Realistically, one could speak of many millions of euros, and in the case of a prestigious auction, even of an amount difficult to predict, because comparable cars practically do not exist. Ordinary, very rare pre-war Alfas from the era achieve high prices, but the Aerodynamica would additionally have the status of a one-off, a pioneer of aerodynamics, a work by Castagna and one of the most recognizable experiments of early motoring. The replica located in the museum belongs to a different category of value. It is not a market original, but a historical and educational object. Its price is practically impossible to determine because it does not function as a car for sale. Its symbolic value, however, is enormous. The technical data of the Aerodynamica best show how unusual the combination of old and new was. The chassis came from the Alfa 4060 HP, designed by Giuseppe Marosi. The construction was based on a ladder frame, leaf spring suspension, rigid axles, and rear-wheel drive. The engine was mounted at the front, longitudinally. It had 4 cylinders in line, a capacity of 6,082 cubic centimeters, valves in the head, magneto ignition, and carburetor fuel supply. Power was around 70 horsepower at 2,200 revolutions per minute. The gearbox had 4 ratios. The brakes acted on the rear wheels, which was typical of the era, although from today's perspective, at speeds exceeding 130 kilometers per hour, it sounds rather frightening. The body was aluminum, streamlined, closed, and 5-seater. The car was around 5.5 meters long. Its height exceeded 2 meters, which made it look more like a fast microbus than a classic sports car. Despite this, the aerodynamic form allowed it to reach a speed of around 139 kilometers per hour, and according to some descriptions, even close to 150 kilometers per hour. Why is the Alfa 4060 HP Aerodynamica an automotive icon? Above all, because it was ahead of its time in an almost absurd way. It was not the first car with a closed body, and it was not the first fast car, but it combined several ideas that would later become crucial. Aerodynamics, a one-box silhouette, aluminum construction, a functional approach to air resistance, and a vision of the car as something more than a carriage with an engine. At a time when most manufacturers were still thinking in terms of mechanics, Riccati and Castagna were thinking about airflow. At a time when cars were designed with a separate hood, cabin, and fenders, they created one streamlined form. At a time when practically no one imagined a family, closed car with sporting performance, they built a 5-seater vehicle capable of speeds reserved for racing machines. It is precisely this mixture of madness, courage, and engineering intuition that makes the Aerodynamica so fascinating. Its significance is even greater because it does not fit into simple categories. It can be called the great-grandfather of aerodynamic cars, but that does not exhaust the subject. It can be said that it foreshadowed minivans because it had a one-box, high body, and room for several people. But after all, it was built on a sporting chassis and had the performance of a competition car. It can be considered one of the first concept cars, but it was created as a private commission, not an official factory show project. It can also be seen as an example of Italian coach-building art, because Castagna created something both technical and sculptural. It is precisely this ambiguity that makes it so important. The Alfa 4060 HP Aerodynamica shows that the history of motoring was full of blind alleys, experiments, and ideas that appeared too early. Not every breakthrough immediately creates a market revolution. Sometimes a breakthrough is forgotten, dismantled, converted into a more ordinary car, and only after years does it turn out that it was one of the boldest projects of its era. The Alfa 4060 HP Aerodynamica therefore remains one of the most unusual cars from before the First World War. Not because it changed the market, because it did not. Not because it immediately began a fashion for streamlined bodies, because the world was not yet ready for it. Its greatness lies elsewhere. It was proof that already in 1914, one could think of a car as an object moving through the air, and not only along the road. It was a vision of the future, built on the mechanics of the past. It had a huge engine, a classic chassis, leaf springs, and rear brakes. But above all this, there was an aluminum form that looked like a preview of a completely different era. Only one example was built. The original disappeared, and today we know it mainly thanks to a reconstruction and archival photographs. Even so, its legend has survived. It is a car that proves that an automotive icon does not have to be produced in thousands of examples or win hundreds of races. Sometimes all it takes is one bold idea, one eccentric customer, and one body that appeared several decades too early.